Okay, briefly I just want to cover a couple of other fasteners. So far we've talked about the metric socket versus the 3/4 inch. That was in the other video, the 3/4 inch versus the 19 millimeter. If you remember, that was a 1/2 inch drive, 19 millimeter 6-point socket. The other one was a 3/4 inch 1/2 inch drive 6-point socket. We talked about the bolts that fit down in there, both the metric and the US customary, and how to identify them and the similarities between them. So at this point I would expect that you know how to identify whether it's US customary. You know that if it's a US customary, you're going to use a fractional socket. You're not going to go over and try to use a metric socket or a metric wrench to install or remove it. But there are other fasteners that are other than those. Those were hex bolts. They were 6 points. So let's look at these two sockets. There's two sockets here. Both of them are 14 millimeter, but one of them, this one, is the 6-point. So this is a 14 millimeter 6-point 3/8 drive socket. Remember that? That was the measurement from here. The diameter is 3/8 of an inch. So that's the reason it's called the 3/8 drive. And then this one here is a 12-point. So there's 12 points in here, and this thing is blurring out, so it's hard for you to see, but you can see it if you get a hold of it. And if you counted each one of these points, there would be 12 going all the way around. Why 12? Well, it comes in handy for a lot of things that you'll find out in practical experience. Sometimes you're working in tight quarters and you would want to use a 12-point socket on a 6-point bolt for removing it. We'll cover that later. But most of the time you would want to match it up and use a 6-point with, and I'll talk a little bit more about this thing here in a moment. You'd want to use a 6-point socket on a 6-point bolt. So what's the real reason to have a 12 other than the fact that sometimes you can, well, the 6-point will fit into it as well as the 6-point sockets, because they have 12-point bolts out there. This is a 12-point bolt, and it'll only fit in a 12-point socket. It will not fit in a 6-point. All right, so we've kind of got that a little bit straight. So let's look. I told you how to identify fasteners, but I came across one that was a little different. That is a US customary, and what they did was they put the little hash marks or tick marks, 3 of them up here, 3 of them down here. And my goodness, I wish you could see it better on the camera. Make sure that you see it in the classroom when you come in so that you'll understand what I'm talking about here. But this thing has actually got 3 little tick marks, kind of like this, at the top, and then at the, I'll draw another 3 down here. So there's 3 up here and 3 down here. It's still a grade 8. Now that we have said that, let's talk this socket, which is kind of out of the ordinary and we don't use much. It's an 8-point socket. This particular one is 3/4 of an inch. No, it's not. I correct myself. It's a 7/8. No, I was right to begin with. I had it upside down. That's what I get for looking at the camera instead of the socket. It's 3/4 inch, 1/2 inch drive, 8-point. We can count these: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Very nice for square fasteners, square-headed fasteners. Fit very well into it. And why would we use that and not just use a open-end wrench or a adjustable wrench to remove this fastener? As you can see, it's fairly large, it's fairly long. Take a lot of turns if this thing was tightened all the way up, so it'd be nice to use a ratchet and socket to remove it, rather than having to work herself to death with a open end wrench or a adjustable wrench. So while I'm on these fasteners, you've seen a square one, you've seen the 12 point, and these are the most common, and certainly there are a heck of a lot more that you're going to have to learn as we move along. This thing here that I had out there is a stud, probably a rocker stud. Screw it down into something, put something on top of it, whatever it is, tighten a nut down on top of it. This one right here probably is for intake manifold, but that's another one. Looks a little different, doesn't have the little hex nut made onto it. This one you would screw in using a inverted Torx, so or spline drive, and this gets screwed into the intake, into the engine block, and then we mount the intake manifold on top of it, and then take a hex nut and screw down on top of that to hold the intake manifold to the engine block. So that's what that is, and it's called a stud. Here's a rocker stud. Here's the common theme here is stud. Here's a lug stud. This one's pressed in. It's used to hold your tire, your wheel and tire onto the spindle of the or axle of the car. And these are lug nuts. Not that one. That's another one of those press-in lug studs. Both of these are kind of ugly. These are probably covered up with wheel cover or something like that, hubcap if you want to call it that. And this one's kind of pretty. So this one would be on a mag and exposed. So that is my little lesson on some of the more common fasteners that you're going to be dealing with in automotive. Thanks.